It's good to see you here this morning. I know that Saturday mornings are a tough time for anybody, and I know some are still filtering in, but we're glad you're here this morning, and we're absolutely honored to have Brother David Barton with us. And I'm going to have Brother Steve Wilson, who basically is the driving force behind all of this and has been praying about this for some time and came to me 6 or 8 months ago and says, we've got a date. And I said, well, just make it happen. And so he's done a great job getting the word out. And we're glad you're here. I'm going to have a word of prayer. And I just want to say on behalf of our church family, welcome today. And I know that you're going to be blessed and challenged and get information that you're going to do some things with. And I'm thankful that we're a church that is patriotic, that we do love the Lord, that we are unashamedly behind what this nation was founded on. And we're glad that you feel the same way that you're here today. Let's pray together. Precious Father, I do pray in the name of our blessed Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, that you might bless our time today. I thank you for the planning. I thank you for the hard work and the preparation that's gone into this time. And I do pray that you'll bless not only this session, but the other 2 sessions that will follow this one. I pray that you'll stir the hearts of people that have been invited, that have made commitments, and that they'll come on this way, even if they come a bit late. And I thank you for Steve and Carol and the extraordinary job they've done in promoting this and getting the word out. And I pray for our speaker today that you'd fill him with the Spirit of God, that you'd give him an anointing, give him clarity. And I know he's traveled a good distance to be here with us, and I pray you'll use him today to excite, to motivate, to challenge, to stir us up about the things that really and truly matter, not only for our nation, but for our children and our children's children. We pray these things in Jesus' precious holy name and for his sake. Amen. Brother Steve, you come, my friend. When you finish, just stick it right back in there.
Good morning. Let me give you just a little background. David and I go back to the 80s. My wife and I were in a church, and the pastor brought David in to speak. And I heard him speak, and I thought to myself, I learned this in public school. And do you really believe you can learn it in public school today? Absolutely not. So what changed? What changed was the heart of America. That's what's changed. And David has tried to keep the original spirit of the founder of the country alive all these years. He founded in 1987 Wall Builders, an organization out of Texas, which promoted this, what the country was initially intended to be. For 9 years, he was vice chair of the Texas Republican Party. He and his wife, Cheryl, have been married 37 years. 3 grown children, 3 grandchildren. And Cheryl was telling me a son-in-law and a son are active duty in the Army. And she's got a son who flies Black Hawk helicopters. That's the kind of guy. You know what? I love the military. There's only 2 people who are willing to die for me. Jesus Christ and the United States military. Think about it. That's the only 2 people willing to die for me. So when I got together with the pastor and I said, Pastor, we need to bring this guy to Raleigh, to Knightdale. And my initial contact with Wall Builders was 18 months ago when I initially contacted him. And the girl said, well, you know, he's real busy. And I said, I understand, but we want him to come. Now, you got to understand my background. I was in pharmaceutical sales for 30 years. No does not mean anything to me. No is an opportunity to get a yes the next time you talk to him. So the pastor there's a conference in Charlotte last February 14, called Renewing America. And Mike Huckabee sponsored it. And so Carol and I went to Charlotte. 600 pastors from 5 states were there. And I looked up, and David Barton is one of the speakers. So at the break, I went down, and I said, David, we want you to come to Knightdale. Well, you know, Steve, I'm real busy. I said, I understand that, David, but that doesn't mean anything. You got to come. He said, well, he gave me the email address of this lady in scheduling. He said, contact her and see what she can do. So February 14, fast forward to August 14, and finally they said, all right, he'll come in April of 15. So Carol and I both work at the General Assembly. I retired. My wife said, no, as long as I'm working, you're going to work. So I now am a Senate Sergeant in Arms. And she works for one of the finest human beings in the General Assembly, Senator Buck Newton from Wilson. I want you a little sidebar. Go to YouTube and Google Senator Buck Newton of Wilson. It let him hear the speech he made on the Senate floor on the marriage amendment. I want you to listen to that. That's the kind of people we've got now at the General Assembly. They're dedicated Christians. So all this evolved into David Barton now coming to Knightdale. And I'm just so excited to really introduce one of my heroes, is David Barton. Let's bring David Barton to the stage.
Thanks, brother. Thank you guys for being out here on a Saturday morning. Let me start off with something the Bible tells us very clearly. The Bible teaches us that we're to remember the former days, to recall the former times. And that is an admonition for us to know our history, quite frankly. So the Bible talks about recalling the former days, remembering the former times, and gives us Bible verse after Bible verse, Old and New Testament, that tells us to remember our history. And the Bible shows us that the way that a people remembers his history is the way that people behaves. So we're going to look at some history this morning, but not just history the way we do it today. I've been appointed in a number of states by state boards of education, by governors, to write the social studies standards for students in those states. And we teach history today, but we no longer teach God in history. We no longer teach what we're going to call providential history. So providential history is looking at what God did in history, God's role in history, things we can learn from history, and that's what we'll cover. And in doing that, I want to introduce you to a founding father named George Mason. He's one of the 55 individuals who framed the Constitution of the United States. He specifically is the man who is responsible for the Bill of Rights. Matter of fact, we call him the father of the Bill of Rights. He's also the man who wrote the Constitution for Virginia in 1776. Like North Carolina, many of the early states wrote their constitutions in 1776 when they separated. He wrote a statement in the Constitution of Virginia that is so profound that is still in the Constitution today. And this is what he said. He said, "No free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles." Now, the phrase I want to emphasize is a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. In other words, you have to keep going back to basic things. If you're in athletics, and I was in athletics for a long time, if you're in professional sports, you got the greatest athletes in the world, and every year they go back to do basics. We're in baseball season now. They just got done with spring training. They go back to hitting and pitching and throwing, all the simple things. Doesn't matter how great you are as an athlete, you keep going back to simple things. You do that in football, you have camps. You do that in basketball, you have camps. So the greatest athletes keep going back. They have a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, and that's what spring training is all about, and that's what other athletic things are about. We're going to do that this morning. We're going to go back to fundamental principles. And by the way, that is a biblical principle to do that. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1, the Bible says we must pay the most careful attention to what we've already heard so that it's not slip away. In other words, you have to keep going back to the fundamental thing. Oh, I've heard that before. Great. Hear it again and again and again. I love one of the translations, the way it says that. It says you have to pay careful attention to what you've heard, lest it leak away. And it's like a spare tire. When you finally go for the spare tire that you need, it's oftentimes flat because it's leaked out. It's not much a problem now as it used to be in previous generations. But keeping a spare tire aired up, you just had to look after it all the time. And that's core principles. You keep going back to the things you're going to need. Let me give you an example of how that works in the United States. If you look at the U.S. Capitol, on the south end, which this is the west front, so over here on the right, this is the House of Representatives. Inside the House of Representatives, around the top of the chamber, you'll find 23 little reliefs around the top of the chamber. As you look across the house, you see these things across there. And what they are the 23 great lawgivers in the history of the world. This is a lawmaking body for the United States, so they have these 23 reliefs. They show you 23, Lycurgus and Justinian and Leo, and they have all these great lawgivers. And you notice they're all looking at the side. You get what's called a side relief or side profile. The only one in the chamber out of the 23 where you get the full face is the face of Moses. And he's looking down on the chamber. He's right at the back. He looks down on the speaker's rostrum. Moses is watching what's going on in the House of Representatives. Now, Moses, of course, we know we relate him to the Ten Commandments. And I've been involved in a number of court cases. I've been involved in 7 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. And back in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of cases we got involved with that dealt with 10 Commandments. And you're more likely to find a copy of the 10 Commandments hanging in a government building than you are in a church building, because the 10 Commandments has been the basis of civil law in America. So suddenly there were all these lawsuits saying, oh, you can't have the 10 Commandments hanging in a government building. That's unconstitutional. And so as the courts would look at that issue, they would often rule against the 10 Commandments. And the judges, in trying to accommodate, and by the way, there were some really key cases that came out of North Carolina on this. So many of your courts had the 10 Commandments hanging. And the judges said, well, we'd really like to leave the 10 Commandments up there. Maybe if you diversify the exhibit a bit. Maybe if you were to show how the Code of Hammurabi influenced Americans, showed the Code of Justinian. And if you had a bunch of legal things up there, we could leave the 10 Commandments, but you can't just leave the 10 Commandments by themselves. And when they said that, it told me that those judges knew exactly nothing about history, because they think the 10 Commandments are too religious. If they've read the Code of Justinian opens up by saying, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we pass the following laws. If they think the 10 Commandments is too religious, wait till you get to the Code of Justinian, because it is Jesus Christ oriented. It's not just Old Testament. And then the other thing that was really funny was Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi, his code was given 300 years before Moses gave the 10 Commandments. So Hammurabi, that's an old legal code. So what was its influence on America? And by the way, here's the code of this Hammurabi, and this is his code right there. What was its influence on America? Zero. It wasn't discovered till 1904. So even though he lived 300 years before Moses, the code wasn't even found until 1904, and then they had to translate it. It didn't have any impact. But these judges say, well, if you hang the Code of Hammurabi, you know why we don't use the Code of Hammurabi today, even though it's older than the Code of Moses? Real simple. Now, there's 282 laws that you'll find in the Code of Hammurabi. Let me show you some of the laws out of there. For example, this is law number 2. Law number 2 says, if anyone bring an accusation against a man, and the accuser go to the river and leap into the river, if he sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river prove that the accuser is not guilty, and he escape unhurt, then he who had brought the accusation shall be put to death, while he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house that had belonged to his accuser. Is there any chance we're going to apply that in America today? Don't think so. So if you can swim, you're innocent. If you drown, what is the deal? And look at this. Here's another one of the laws. This is law 132. If the finger is pointed at a man's wife about another man, say, oh, she's committed adultery, but she is not caught sleeping with another man, she shall jump into the river for her husband. Again, I don't know what the river is with these guys, but they've got a fixation on the river. Is there any chance we're going to apply those laws today? No. And if you go through the 282 laws in the Code of Hammurabi, there's only 1 or 2 that we might possibly apply today. Now, on the other hand, you take what Moses did 300 years later, God wrote it with his own finger. If you look at the Code of Moses, the 10 Commandments, how many of those are still applicable today? Every one of them. Profanity is out, honor your parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery. Every one of those is still relevant. And see, the difference is the 10 Commandments is built on principles that relate to human nature. The Code of Hammurabi is built on specifics. That's what makes the Bible so timeless. It's built on principles. And by the way, that's what makes the Constitution timeless. In schools today and universities, kids are often taught, oh, that's an old document. Why, the guys who wrote that, they rode around on horses. They didn't have internet. No, that's outdated. No, it's not outdated because it doesn't deal with specifics. It deals with principles. Principles are timeless. As long as you deal with the principle of gravity, when's that going to get outdated? It's not going to get outdated. It's something that's timeless. Boyle's law of gases, it's not going to get outdated. And because of Boyle's law of gases 400 years ago, I can go scuba diving now. Newton's laws of gravity, because they still exist. That's why I can fly planes. So all this old stuff creates principles by which new things continue to work. That's the way that it is with the country. So it doesn't matter how old something is. It matters whether it's based on a principle, and we have to have a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. Now, having said that, we are very blessed in this country. We have stability unlike any other nation. I'll talk about this more tomorrow. But we've been 238 years under the same piece of paper. We have creativity unlike any other nation. America has 4% of the world's population, yet every year we produce more inventions than the other 96% of the world combined. 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's inventions. We don't. We produce more than 96%. And the same with our prosperity. We're only 4% of the world's population, and yet we produce 25% of the world's gross domestic product. This has caused us to be very unique, and it's been this way for generations. As a matter of fact, a man named Alexis de Tocqueville came to America back in 1831, wrote the book Democracy in America. He said, I've got to see what's going on in this nation. And the reason he did that was he was an elected official. He was a government official in his nation. He was particularly involved with criminal justice. And they were having big criminal justice problems in France. As a matter of fact, the guillotine, they executed some 40,000 people in France. And he looked at America and said, they're not doing this. Let's go see why they're different, see what makes them so different from others. And by the way, to show you the contrast he was thinking of, let me take you to a man named James Kent. James Kent is called the father of American jurisprudence. This is the guy, he's one of the two guys considered to have laid the entire foundation for the American law and court system. Well, he was on the Supreme Court of New York. And on the Supreme Court of New York, he was there for 16 years, and in 16 years, he handled 1,755 cases in 16 years. And James Kent wrote about how that he was appalled at the crime rate, at the crime wave that we had in America back then. He could not believe all the murders that were occurring. And you look at what he writes about and what he says, I mean, out of 1,755 cases in 16 years, he is appalled that we have so many murders, and they had 8 murders in New York in 16 years. A murder every other year? New York City averages a murder every day. Chicago used to average a murder every 8 hours. They've got 1 murder every other year, and he's appalled at the crime wave that's going on in America? You see, that's why Alexis de Tocqueville wanted to come to America and say, what is the deal with these guys? I mean, we got 40,000 put to death over here. They've only got 8 murders in 16 years. So he comes to America, and he looked at it, and that's where he wrote his observations in Democracy in America, and we'll talk about that book a little later on. But he's the guy that wrote the phrase, he said, this is exceptional. I've never been in a nation like this. America's exceptional. I don't think we'll ever see any other nation like this. That's where we get the term American exceptionalism. Now today, academics do not like this term. If you're at university, you'll be told this is a really bad deal. American exceptionalism is just a recognition that America is different from other nations. And as much as professors may not like it, we are different from other nations. We're different in so many ways, but they want us to be like everybody else. They want us to be like Europe, and so they don't like American exceptionalism. Well, regardless of that, they don't like it, but they never get around to defining it. So let me see if I can define the term for you, American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is what describes the unprecedented stability, freedom, and prosperity that is the result of institutions and policies that are produced by a unique governing philosophy. Now notice the sequence there. Notice how this goes. A unique governing philosophy is what produces our institutions and policies, and those institutions and policies is what produces all the fruit that we enjoy, all the good things, the prosperity, the stability, the freedom. So the most important part of American exceptionalism is your unique governing philosophy. You see, the reason other nations don't get the same results we do is they don't have the same philosophy of governance that we do. Ours is unique because what we have, and quite frankly, being in the country, being rural kind of folks, we understand it well by looking at a fruit tree. You understand the 3 aspects of a fruit tree. The first is a seed. It's what you plant. That's what we would consider to be the philosophy. From that seed grows the infrastructure. That's where you get the trunk and the branches and everything that kind of makes up the composition of the tree. That's our institution policies, and that is what eventually produces the fruit up top. Now, you look at that, and the most important part is not the fruit. Everybody wants good fruit, but the most important part is the seed or the philosophy. In other words, you're not going to enjoy apples if you planted a lemon seed. It's just not going to happen. So you have to go back to the seed that you plant. And so when you look at that, what is the philosophy that produced American exceptionalism? And our founders very clearly wrote it down for us. It is in the Declaration of Independence, our national birth certificate. In that document, in 126 words, they give us 5 immutable principles on which they created American government. This is our philosophy of governments. Every single thing in the Constitution goes back to one of those 5 principles. So let me show you the philosophy that comes forth in 126 words, and this is a document we no longer study in school. We no longer memorize this section of 126 words. We used to do this, but we don't now. These 126 words starts real simply. It says, all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator. Now, that little phrase, what's the first thing that it tells us about our philosophy of government? It tells us, first off, that we acknowledge that there is a divine Creator. We say that up front. Now, today we're told by the courts, well, you know, we've got a lot of people who don't believe in God, who don't believe in a divine Creator, and so we really can't have you saying that publicly. Kids can't say God at graduation. You can't have nativity scenes up in public. You can't do that because some people don't believe that. And we in government, we have to be neutral between religion and non-religion. We can't take a position. No, time out. Sorry. This Declaration of Independence is not a this is not a private letter written from Thomas Jefferson to George Washington. This is, as it says right there, this is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This is every governmental body in America unanimously saying that we all believe there's a divine Creator, and we're telling the world that we believe there's a divine Creator. Now, the fact that we do this officially and not privately says this is the philosophy of our government. This is what we do. And the fact that we have government acknowledge the belief in God, that is the first step toward limiting government. Why so? Because we have just told government that there is a power that exists that is higher than government. See, the problem we have today is government thinks it is God. And since it thinks it is God, it tells us what rights we can and can't have, what we can and can't. As long as the government thinks it's the highest power out there, it will run every aspect of our life. Our philosophy was, you're not the highest thing out there. There's something much higher than you, and that is God Almighty. And He's the power that we acknowledge above government. So that was the first step in having a limited government, and that's what America has been known for 238 years, is a limited government, and it came from that. Now, it's interesting, you take George Washington. George Washington, he explained why this was so important. As a matter of fact, when you look, we're very blessed in our organization. We own about 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I have thousands of the handwritten documents of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, etc. And this is the first federal prayer proclamation that was ever given in American history. You see there, signed at the bottom, George Washington. Federal government now exists. Washington's president, and he issues this proclamation for the nation to stop and acknowledge God. Why does George Washington think the nation should stop and acknowledge God? Well, it's interesting. You see the paragraph there at the top. This is what he says. Washington says, it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge, and by the way, notice the word duty there. Duty is a word that's really gotten away from Americans in the last generation or so. Duty still means something in the military. It tends to mean something to rural people. But duty today is not defined as it was back then. Their definition of the word duty, and you see the word duty there, the word duty meant a legally binding contractual obligation. Now, I built houses for about 20 years in Texas, and in that 20 years when I built houses, the bank that I dealt with, we exchanged hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They would give me the money to build the house. I would sell the house, give them the money back. They would loan me the money. And we went back and forth on this for years and years. And in all those years that I did business with the bank, we never once signed a piece of paper on anything, because I gave my word I'd pay them back. They gave their word. They would loan me the money. We had a duty to keep our word. It was a legally binding contractual obligation. Our word was a legal contract. We didn't have to write it down like we do today with 43 attorneys notarizing everything that goes on. We had a legally binding contractual, we had a duty. Now, the problem we have is in 1913, the word duty was redefined in dictionaries to mean a responsibility. And the definition of duty, if you look it up today, is that which one ought to do. There's a heck of a lot of difference between that which one ought to do and a legally binding contractual obligation. Their word duty is, Washington says, it's a legally binding contractual obligation of nations, not individuals. He said nations to do 4 things. Look at the 4 verbs that he uses. Nations have a legally binding contractual obligation to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor, and that's the duty of nations. Nations have an obligation to do those 4 things. Now, that's not saying you can acknowledge God if you want to kind of stuff. We're saying, no, we have a legally binding contractual obligation in this country to acknowledge God. Of course, that's the first principle of government. That's what we set forth. So that is the first principle, that we acknowledge there's a divine creator. Now, from that comes the second principle, and the second principle says they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, with that statement, we have just acknowledged that there are certain rights that don't come from government, they come from God. This acknowledgement is the second step to limiting government, because what this acknowledgement does is it recognizes there are distinct jurisdictions. Let me see if I can explain it this way. I'm a cowboy, have a ranch in Texas, the horse and cattle and everything that go with it. And as such, I've got a great pickup. I've got a nice red Ford pickup I like a lot, use it a lot on the ranch. But I noticed Pastor Mick doesn't have, he's got a white pickup. I like red pickups. So I go over and paint Pastor Mick's pickup red because everybody needs a red pickup. I can't do that. I can paint anything of mine red if I want to. I can't paint anybody else's stuff red because that's not in my jurisdiction. I have jurisdictional authority over everything that belongs to me. If it doesn't belong to me, I can't touch it. That's what we just told government. Government, not everything comes from you. There are a certain set of rights that come from God, and you're not allowed to touch them. That's not your property. It's not your jurisdiction. You can't go spray paint it red just because you think they belong to you. As much as you like red, you can't do that. That's what we've just acknowledged. There are certain rights that come from God. So this is the second point to the philosophy of American government. And it's interesting because today, just like we cannot define the word exceptionalism, we have difficulty with the word inalienable. Fortunately, the guys who wrote the document told us the definition of that word. You have John Dickinson. John Dickinson not only helped with the Declaration, but he went on to be a signer of the Constitution. He said, an inalienable right is a right which God gave you and which no inferior power has a right to take away. It came to you from God, and nobody else can touch it. You have Alexander Hamilton, signer of the Constitution, general in the American Revolution. He explained he defined an inalienable right this way. He said, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They're written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by any mortal power. These rights didn't come out of any government document. The rights we're talking about here came to us directly from God. They're written by His hand and by the hand of no one else. John Adams, signer of the Declaration, defined it this way. He said, inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly government. They're rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws. They're rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. Again, inalienable rights, they don't come from man, they come from God. And notice what he said here. He said they're antecedent to all earthly government. So what does that mean? Antecedent means that it comes before, or it came before, or existed before earthly governments. In other words, government did not create these rights. All these rights were created before government ever existed. Now, question here is, what is the first earthly government in the history of man? In the history of the world, what was the first earthly government that we had? First earthly government you find appearing with Noah. It appears in Genesis 9. After Noah gets off the ark, his sons and their wives get off the ark, God says, okay, here's the deal. We're going to have civil government. And he gives what are called the Noahide laws. 7 laws that God gave Noah, the Noahide laws by which civil government became organized and ruled. So God gave laws on what you do with murder, what you do with theft, and law and order kind of stuff. That's the first civil government. So if inalienable rights are antecedent to earthly government, that means inalienable rights are what you find in Genesis 1 through 8. Now, the Founding Fathers were able to identify roughly 24 inalienable rights in Genesis 1 through 8. They went through Genesis 1 through 8 and said, well, here's the rights that God have given, and we'll talk about these rights more in a little bit. But the point is, the second point of our philosophy is that God gives a certain set of rights that government is not allowed to touch. Now, what are the rights that God gives? We've now defined an inalienable right. What are those rights? Again, the Founding Fathers are very good at defining this. Samuel Adams says it this way. He says, well, first, there's a right to life. There's a right to liberty. There's a right to property. We told you in the Declaration that these are 3 rights, but we said that they were among others. And so in addition to life, liberty, and property, 11 years later, when we wrote the Bill of Rights, they said, you remember we told you there were 3 among others? Well, here's some of the others. And so you have the First Amendment right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. You have the Second Amendment right to defend yourself, the right to keep and bear arms. You have the Third Amendment right to the sanctity of the home. You have the Fourth Amendment right to justice. You have the Fifth Amendment right to own private property. See, all the Bill of Rights goes through and names other inalienable rights that government's not allowed to touch, because these are rights that God gave before government ever existed. So you can't regulate these rights because they don't belong to you. It's not your pickup. You can't paint it red. It doesn't belong. So this was the philosophy that they had. That's the second point that made us different from all of the nations. The third point, in addition to inalienable rights coming from God, we said that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Secure what rights? Inalienable rights. We're just talking about it. To secure inalienable rights, governments are... Oh, now we've got the purpose of government. Government exists to secure inalienable rights. That's the reason government... So we now know our third point is that government exists to protect inalienable rights. A number of founders talked about this. You have, for example, James Wilson. He not only signed the Declaration, he also signed the U.S. Constitution, one of only 6 founding fathers who signed both documents. He's the second most active member of the Constitutional Convention. He was put on the U.S. Supreme Court by George Washington as an original justice. He started the first law school in America. I have his original law books. And in those law books, James Wilson says, students, here's why government exists. Here's why we created government in America. We had a British government, but we had to create our own new government in America. He said, very simply, he said the principal object of government was to acquire a new security of possession of those rights which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise, all-beneficent Creator. Government exists to protect and secure those rights, but Great Britain began to abuse those rights, no longer secured those rights. It took away our guns and magazines when it invaded Williamsburg and took away all the powder there. And it came into our private homes in Boston, which it can't. And so British violated all this stuff. That's why we started our new government, was to have a new security for the possession of those rights which God had already given to us. That's why we started American government. Sam Adams says the same thing. He's the father of the American Revolution. Sam Adams says government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. This is why government does not exist to make sure we have prosperity, to make sure we have a good economy, to make sure we have jobs. The first and primary responsibility of government is to make sure we have the right to practice the rights that God gave us. Those inalienable rights. That's the first thing they're not quite doing that. The right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, well, unless it involves a homosexual wedding or a homosexual wedding cake or, the rights of conscience. Well, Hobby Lobby, you don't have the rights of conscience if it involves abortifacients. I mean, if it involves abortion, Catholic Church, you don't have the rights of conscience. Government didn't give us the rights of conscience. Government can't regulate the rights of conscience. Government exists to protect the rights of conscience. So the more secular we become, the more we lose those rights. Well, we need to control those gun things. You might actually shoot somebody with some of that. Yeah, exactly, self-defense. So it starts regulating rights the more secular it becomes. But this is back to our philosophy. Now I want you to notice something that he said here. He said government was originally designed for the preservation of inalienable rights. He said, first, a right to life. Secondly, liberty. Thirdly, property. So he said government exists to protect inalienable rights, and the first 3 of those rights are these. Now, notice what he says here. He says first is a right to life. Wouldn't that be cool if they'd been talking about abortion? Because then we could go into court and argue original intent. We can say, hey, look, the Declaration here talks about the right to unborn life, not just life, but unborn life. Founding fathers didn't want abortions. It violates original, but of course, that's not what they were talking about because abortion wasn't an issue back then. And I've heard people say that, and I go, why would you say that? The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. As long as there were people who were pregnant, there were people who did not want to be pregnant. There's nothing new about abortion. The technology changes, the issues don't change, which is why one of the books we have in our library deals with abortion in America back in 1808. Wow, abortion way back then? Yes. Founding fathers spoke very clearly about it, folks like Thomas Jefferson, James Wilson, others. So when they say first is a right to life, that also means unborn life. That means abortion issue. Matter of fact, going back to James Wilson, in that law book that he wrote, he talked to students about this. And this is what he told students. He says, students, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. He said, in the contemplations of law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb, and by the law that life is protected. He said, listen up, kids. He said, from the time that you know that there is an infant in the womb, at that point, that life is protected. And he said, by the common law. That's the 7th Amendment to the Constitution is what incorporates the common law. Now, here's where technology changes, because back then, how long did it take them to know that they had life in the womb? 2-3 months to know for sure. Today, we know within 6 days of fertilization. The point is that once you know there's life there, government has a responsibility to protect that life, because that life didn't come from government, it came from God, and government can't regulate what's God's. Matter of fact, John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration, said that's what makes us different from Europe. In Europe, people over there, parents think that they give life to kids. In America, we know that parents don't give life to kids. God gives life to kids. So over in Europe, they let parents take the life of the kids through abortion. We don't let that happen in America, because we know that life doesn't come from parents. Life comes from God. As he pointed out, he said, a perfect right in a state of natural liberty is the right to life. He says, in America, we've denied the power of life and death to parents. We don't let parents take the life of their unborn kids, because that doesn't belong to them. It belongs to God. This is jurisdictional stuff again. So when Sam Adams says first is a right to life, I want to emphasize that word first for a minute, because you heard Steve mention earlier that I was in political office for 9 years. And in that period of time, I trained literally thousands of candidates for office. I recruited hundreds of candidates for office. I'm very involved with political campaigns now. Probably 120 members of the U.S. Congress I consider to be very good friends. I'm very much involved in the political realm. And what I have learned is if I can find out first where someone is on the life issue, if I can find out what they believe about life, unborn life and euthanasia, if I can find out where they are on that one issue with a 90% degree of certainty, I can tell you how they will vote on every other issue they face. If I know where they are in life, I will tell you how they voted on the UN Convention on the Small Arms Treaty. If I know where they are on life, I'll tell you what they do with taxes. If I know where they are on life, I'll tell you what they do on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, tell me where they are in life with a 90% degree of certainty. I'll tell you where they are on any other issue. Now, why is that? Because, as they said, first is a right to life. If you don't get the first of the inalienable rights right, you miss the second and third, because you're off course. And once you get off course, you're off course on everything. And so that's why if you're wrong on the life issue, you'll also be wrong on the First Amendment right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. See, those that are wrong on the life issue don't support the right of conscience for objecting to homosexual marriage, or the right of conscience to object to. They're not going to. No, you're going to conform, and you're going to. If you're wrong on the life issue, you're wrong on the right to worship God. Hey, kid, you can't say God at graduation. What were you thinking? Well, you'll find the people who say that are the ones who are wrong on the life issue. You'll also find that if you're wrong on the life issues, you'll be wrong on the right to defend yourself. The Founding Fathers called it the biblical right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms. Those that are wrong on life will be wrong on self-defense. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the sanctity of the home. And it is amazing that those that are wrong on life are also wrong on the definition of marriage. And those two go hand in hand. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Fifth Amendment issue for the protection of private property. You'll think that property belongs to the government, and government has the right to take it from you and give it to someone else who can do something better with it, or it's not your property. We'll tax you for it, and you pay us for it. We'll let you rent your property. If you don't pay taxes, we'll take it away from you. See, if you're wrong on the life issue, you're wrong on pride. You get all these. Now, granted, all of these are what are called social issues, and we're told by the media today and by the political pundits that, oh, voters don't care about social issues. All they care about are those economic issues. Well, let's pretend for a minute that we don't care about social issues. All we care about is economic issues. And if you care about economic issues, there's a whole lot to care about. I mean, there's a ton of stuff that you can, just low-hanging fruit on economic issues. Now, if we're going to look at economics, and I understand that every session of Congress, between 10 and 13,000 bills are introduced every session. So that's why you have all these groups that monitor the voting records of all these folks. You got the Navy group that monitors how they vote on the dozens of votes they have on the Navy. You got the China caucus who monitors how they vote on issues related to China. You have the Iran. There's a group for everything, because with 10 to 13,000 bills, you're covering everything. So that's why you get voting records from different groups showing how people stand. For example, when you look at the House of Representatives, you want to know how they vote on the life issue, because first is life. Well, you go to the voting record for national right to life, because they take all 435 members of the House, and they will rank them from the best, and there will be dozens of votes on the life issue every Congress. And so they tell you how they vote on the life issue. Now, if you want to know who the best life representatives are in Congress out of 435, and there's 100 senators, 535 total, they rank them. These are all the 100%ers. You go down, these are the folks who vote right on the life issue every time. 100% of the time, they're right. But remember, we don't care about life. What we care about is economics. So if we want to see who the best economic representatives are, we go to monitoring groups that monitor economics, like you have Freedom Works, or you have National Taxpayers Union, you have Americans for Prosperity, and it's a strange thing. If I look at the best economic votes, it's a 1-to-1 correlation. If you get the life issue right, you get the economic issues right. On the other hand, if I look at the worst life representatives, these are the 0%ers on life, and I look at where they are with economics, and same thing. It's 1-to-1. See, if you don't get the first thing right, you don't get the rest of those things right. So life is the best indicator of how someone is going to vote economically as well as anything else. Now, this makes a lot of sense, because if they won't protect your money, why in the world would they protect your life? And your life is a lot more important than your money, and if they won't protect it. So, and one other little comment here. Because of what I do in politics, I have a lot of folks who come to me and say, would you endorse me for office? And so, congressmen or whoever want me to endorse. And one of the things I've learned, dog catcher wants me to endorse him for office. And so I say, well, before I endorse you, I need to know where you are on the abortion issue. He says, time out. Did you not hear me? I said dog catcher. We don't deal with abortions. I know you don't deal with abortions as dog catcher, but that tells me your philosophy of government. And the problem is you may not stay a dog catcher. You might run for school board. You might run for city council. You might run for mayor. You might run for state rep or state senator. You might run for governor. And it's a whole lot easier to knock you off as a dog catcher than it is to knock you off as a governor. And so when you use that standard and start screening at that level, you start getting better candidates coming up through the top. Because school board doesn't deal with abortion. I don't care about that. Yeah, you do. Life is the first of all issues. Government exists to protect inalienable rights. The first right is the right to life. If you don't get that one right, nothing else works. So that's the third point, and that's why Sam Adams says the right to life, and it doesn't matter whether it's social or economic issues, but that's the third point that made our government distinct, is the government exists to protect inalienable rights, first of which is the right to life. The fourth thing you see is it says, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal stations which the law of nature, nature's God entitles them. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us there is a fixed moral law. Really? How did you get a fixed moral law out of that phrase? Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot to us today, but it did to everybody back then, because there's an 8-word phrase there, the laws of nature and of nature's God. That 8-word phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, was taken out of the most famous law book of the day, Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. Now, Thomas Jefferson said that attorneys read Blackstone's commentaries like Muslims read the Quran. Everybody in America went through Blackstone's commentaries. And what Blackstone explains in his commentaries is that God has revealed himself in 2 ways. And today we say, whoa, there's only one revelation of God. No, God revealed himself in 2 ways. And Blackstone said that both of them show the same thing. He said what happened was God first revealed himself through nature. Now, think about this. Romans 1:20, the Bible says that everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead. Godhead's a pretty deep theological subject. People have been arguing about that for 2,000 years, and yet Paul says everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead, are revealed through what he has created, so that even the heathen are without excuse. In other words, when people say, oh, if you have a loving God, how could he throw people in hell who have never heard the gospel? Paul just told you. God has so revealed himself, so intricately revealed himself through what he's created, that even the heathen don't have an excuse. It's all there. Now, that's the laws of nature. But as Blackstone points out, when Adam sinned, then sin entered mankind, it darkened our nature, and suddenly our understanding wasn't as clear as it had been before. And so God says, okay, let me just write it down for you. And that became the revealed law. But there is no contradiction between the revealed law and the natural law, the laws of nature. Those two always line up. That's what you see in Psalms 19, verses 1 through 7. That's what you see in Romans 1. So that's the dual revelation of God. It's the same thing, but God's revealed himself in 2 means. And by the way, that's why we're told in Psalm 46:10 to be still and know that I'm God. If you get still and look at nature, you'll see all sorts of things about God. And that's why it's so hard to find an atheist in the country. You find atheists in the city. If you're in the country, you see nature, you see creation, it's easy to be still and know that I'm God. When you're surrounded by skyscrapers in the city, it's a lot harder to know what God looks like because you don't have the time to be still and know that He's God. So you take the laws of nature, and nature's God. And let's take the first one here. We're not going to use the Bible at all for the next few minutes. What we're going to do is we're simply going to use the laws of nature. What do the laws of nature tell us about self-defense? Now, the Bible tells us we got a right to self-defense, whether it's Exodus 22:2 or whether we go to Luke 17 or whether we go to Nehemiah 4 and Nehemiah 6. All these Bible verses on the right to self-defense, but we're not going to use that. What does nature tell us about self-defense? And by the way, I mentioned that I'm a cowboy. My idea of a vacation, and that I do this 3 or 4 times a year. I get some pastor friends of mine, and we all jump on our horses, and we take off into the wild parts of the country. And so we will go in places where you can't find a person for 50 miles, essentially. And that's our idea of a vacation, is we will go to really rugged. We love to go up into the Colorado Rockies, about 14,000 feet, and get lost in the mountains, try to find a new way out of the mountains. That's fun for us, and we enjoy doing it. So we're very close to nature. We're very close to what happens with there. And because we do so much on our horses, you have to have a really good bond with your horse. And I do. I've got a really good bond with the horse. My pastor friends got really good bonds with the horses. And it's really interesting. We take very good care of our horses because we need them. And we got to have a great relationship. If I stick the nose of my horse off a cliff and say, go down that goat trail on the side, it's got to do that. My life depends on it. Her life depends on it. The same thing if we come to a river and I say, got to swim the river, got to do it. Her life depends on mine. So we have this great relationship. We take care of our horses very well. Interesting thing, however, one of those mares recently had a foal. And as great as our relationship is, you go into the barn and you'll come out with a hoof print in the middle of your forehead, right there. We've got a great relationship, and suddenly it kicks into her, you can't get near my young. I've got to defend my young from you. And she will chase us out of the barn and go, wait a minute. She thinks the barn's her home. Now, we built the barn for her. We gave her the barn, but she thinks it's her home. It kicks into her that I've got to defend my young. I've got to defend my family. I have to defend my home. It's all over nature that way. It doesn't matter whether you look at horses or whether you look at dogs or whether you look at bears or anything else. It's a law of nature that you defend your young, you defend your property, you defend your family. This is law. I don't need the Bible to tell me that. And that's why the Second Amendment, it's an inalienable right. This came before government ever existed. This goes back to the beginning of creation. Well, how about something like liberty? Now, scientists tell us there's between 6 and 10 million species that are identified in the world today. And in no species is there slavery. Raccoons don't enslave elk. Mice don't enslave deer. Never happens. So liberty is a law of nature that existed before any government ever came along. Well, why didn't the founding fathers follow that? They were all slave owners. No, they weren't all slave owners. We get told that in school today. The overwhelming majority of the founding fathers were anti-slavery. And the anti-slavery founding fathers used that. They said, guys, you slave owners, it violates the law of nature. There's not a species in nature that enslaves. You're doing something that violates the laws of God. And by the way, James Wilson wrote that in his law books, that slavery is a violation of all natural law. So liberty, that government exists to protect liberty because that came before government existed. You have the same thing with abortion. In those 6 to 10 million species, there's not a single species that kills its young while it's still in the womb. I don't care whether you believe in creation or evolution. I'm a creation guy. You believe in evolution? There is nothing in your evolutionary process that kills its young still in the womb. 6 to 10 million, that's a violation of all natural law. Same with homosexuality. You see, homosexuality, there's out of 10 million species, there's a couple of species that do have some homosexuality, but it's never a lifestyle, and it's always an aberration even in those societies. That's why up to 15 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court called homosexuality a, quote, crime against nature. Didn't call it a crime against the Bible. It's a crime against all natural law. 6 to 10 million species, it doesn't exist. And where it does exist, it's an aberration, even in those societies. Then you've got the right to property. See, from the time that something is born in nature, it stakes out what it considers to be its turf. It doesn't matter whether it's a mouse, it doesn't matter whether it's an eagle or a hawk, whatever it is, it stakes out, and that's its property during its lifetime. Now, when it dies, the property goes to somebody else. Some other deer comes in or some other moose comes in and takes the property, but it has its own property during its lifetime. So that's a law of nature as well. Let me show you some of the others the Founding Fathers pointed to. The right to make a living. Every animal in nature has the right to create a living for itself. Now, that doesn't mean it'll be successful, but every one of them has the right to pursue seeking its own food, its own property, its own family. They've got the right to pursue that. There's no impediments. Now, it may not work because they may be in a drought-ridden area where they can't get what they need, but they have the right to pursue a living. So the right to pursue a living without interference from government, that is a natural right. You also have what the Founding Fathers called expatriation. Expatriation means the ability to move from area to area without hindrance. In other words, a deer can migrate from one area to another. And what used to happen is the colonies put up boundaries with each other and said, you can't come into our colony. No, we're all Americans. We're all in the same continent. We're all in the same country. We all have the same king. And so that's why states today, you can travel freely between states. It's called the right of expatriation. I can decide, you know what, I don't want to live in North Carolina. I want to live in Oklahoma. No, I've changed my mind. I want to be in Nebraska. No, I'm going to Michigan. You can do that. That's the right of expatriation. You have the right to move between those places just as animals do in nature. You also have the right of association. You see, my Holstein cow can decide it wants to be with this herd. No, I've changed my mind. I want to be with this herd. No, I want to be with this. And so they can choose the herd with which they want to run. They can choose their associates. They have the right of association, which the First Amendment used to guarantee us the right of association. We could hang with those we wanted to hang with and not hang with those we didn't want to hang with. And so, but now, no, I have to hang with homosexuals because if I don't, then I'm filled with animus and hate. And so we no longer have the right of association. I don't have the right to choose that my business is going to serve people. I'll serve homosexuals, but I'm not going to serve a homosexual wedding. I won't participate. Not anymore. You don't have that right of association. That was an inalienable right given by God that goes back before government ever existed. I have the right to choose the herd that I'll run with. You also have accumulation and profit. Throughout nature, different species, squirrels accumulate nuts, and pack rats accumulate their stuff, and beavers accumulate leaves, and there's no limit on what they can accumulate. There's not a government inspector that comes in and says, you've accumulated too much. You need to share that with the other beavers. No, you can accumulate as much as you want, make as much profit as you want, and that's a natural right. Franklin and Jefferson both call that the natural right of profit. You can make as much. So all of this is what government's supposed to protect. Now, let's keep going. The laws of nature. What do the laws of nature teach us about things like theft? That's a little different. I know I've got 4 horses that I ride, and when I put feed out for my 4 horses, they don't eat their own feed. They all go to the other horses' feed and try to eat everybody else's feed. It seems to me theft is pretty common in nature. Well, how about something like adultery? That's real common in nature. That's why you got 1 bull and 40 cows in every herd. I mean, monogamy is not a common part of nature. How about incest? Incest is so common in nature, that's why cowboys won't ride Mustangs. Mustangs have been inbred for so many generations, they no longer have the stamina and strength. Incest is common among Mustangs. How about murder? Murder is really common in nature. You ever seen what a skunk does in a hen house? Doesn't go in there to get a meal. It goes in there to spread blood everywhere. Now, wait a minute. If we're saying that laws of nature show us God's will, what do you do with that? Remember, Blackstone said sin's entered, and because of that, it's not as clear. And that's why we also have the laws of nature's God. These are laws of nature, but what we want now is the laws of nature's God. And the laws of nature's God says, very simply, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder. Well, it's between the laws of nature and nature's God. It's between those two, and they're both out of the Bible, by the way. That's where we get what's called the common law. I mentioned before, that's the 7th Amendment of the Constitution. The laws of nature and nature's God give us a fixed moral law. It says in this nation there are certain things that will always be right, always be wrong, because God defined them as right and wrong. They come out of the Bible. And that's why in the common law, up until 20 or 30 years ago, rape was always a crime, burglary was always a crime, murder was always a crime, theft is always a crime, arson is always a crime. Because it comes out of passages like 1 Timothy 1, verses 8 through 10. It came out of passages like Galatians 5, 19 through 21. I mean, we had all these passages, and that's what the common law was biblical rights and wrongs. So that's the 4th principle. The 5th principle It says governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is where we get the idea of the consent of the governed. George Washington expressed it this way. George Washington was a leader in what was called the Federalist Party. George Washington said this. He said, the fundamental principle of our Constitution enjoins or requires that the will of the majority shall prevail. The will of the majority. Majority rules. You have Thomas Jefferson, who was a leader of the Anti-Federalist Party, the other political party of the day, said the same thing. Said, the will of the majority, the natural law of every society is the only sure guardian of the rights of man. So both parties agreed on something, and that is the will of the majority is the rule. Now, this thing on the consent of the governed, or the rule of the majority, it's interesting to know. And remember the 5 principles at this point that have made America different from all of the nations. We start with the acknowledgement of divine creator. We then say that the divine creator gives certain rights. We then point out that government exists to protect the rights the divine creator gives every individual. We say there is a fixed moral law, and then we say the consent of the governed. Notice the order that comes in. The first 4 are God-centered. The 5th one, the consent of the governed, notice that it comes after inalienable rights and after moral law. It means the consent of the governed doesn't get to decide on moral rights and wrongs. The consent of the governed, if we have a referendum that says, we voted on rape, and by a margin of 78 to 22, we've decided rape is no longer a crime. Sorry, it'll always be a crime because it's a violation of laws of nature and nature's God. The consent of the governed has nothing to say about moral issues. The same with inalienable rights. We've decided that you no longer have a right to defend yourself. By 99-1 margin in the U.S. Senate, you no longer have a, doesn't matter what the Senate votes, I have an inalienable right to defend myself. The will of the majority means nothing with inalienable rights. It means nothing with the issue of moral issues. And that's why the Founding Fathers put it in that order. Now, what you'll find is a secular government will never be a limited government, because 4 of those 5 issues that make us unique are all God-centered. When you become secular, the government replaces God, and then at that point you no longer have protection for rights, you no longer have limits. The government will get involved in telling you what you can and can't do. This is what made us unique. And let me go back to this thing about jurisdictions, because the key to a limited government, as I mentioned, is recognizing jurisdictional lines, recognizing what belongs to government, what doesn't belong to government. Jesus dealt with this back in Matthew 22:21. Remember, they brought him the coin, and he says, well, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. In other words, there is a jurisdiction here between the two, but the problem is Caesar's always wanting to become God. It's not that God's wanting to become Caesar, it's Caesar's wanting to become God. And so this is given to say, hey, there's jurisdictions here. Let me show you how this works on something as simple as the issue of marriage. Take the issue of marriage for just a moment. God defined marriage in Genesis 1-3. But way over in Luke 19, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and they get into the issue of no-fault divorce. And in that passage in Luke 19, Jesus says, guys, look, Moses allowed no-fault divorce, but it wasn't that way at the beginning. Don't you remember that at the beginning, God made them male and female and joined them together and said, this is good. It says, let not man put asunder that which God has joined together. So you now have the definition of marriage. According to Jesus, repeating what God says in Matthew 1, marriage is the lifelong union of a man and a woman. One man, one woman. That's the definition Jesus gave in Luke 19. That's what God gave back at creation before government ever existed. So when you look at that, this is the way we used to understand jurisdictions in America. In other words, if it came from God, government can't touch it. I want to take you to a court case in 1913 called Grigsby versus Reeve. The issue in that court case was whether government could create civil unions. Can government create a civil, you've got religious marriage over here. Can we have a secular version of marriage too? Look what the court said in this opinion. Grigsby versus Reed. The court says marriage was not originated by human law. This is not our jurisdiction. We can't mess with it. It says when God created Eve, she was a wife to Adam. They then there occupied the status of husband to wife and wife to husband. It says the truth is that civil government has grown out of marriage, which created homes and population and society from which government became necessary. Marriages will produce a home and family that will contribute to good society, to a free and just government, the support of Christianity. It would be sacrilegious to apply the designation a civil contract to such a marriage. It's that and more. It's a status ordained by God. We're not about to redefine marriage because it don't belong to us. It belongs to God, and we're not going to touch something that's not ours. Wow. How are we on that today? Not at all. Government, again, thinks it gives all rights. It's no longer recognizing God, and that's why we're having marriage redefined. It used to be a jurisdictional issue. That's what made us distinct from every other nation. So this jurisdictional thing is you don't have that jurisdiction when you have a secular government. Secular government gets into everything. It'll regulate everything. It owns everything. Everything belongs to it. Which is why if you want to preserve the philosophy that made us unique, Thomas Jefferson said this. This is engraved in stone in the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's the first book that he ever wrote back in 1781, comes out of this book. This is what Jefferson said. Jefferson said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we remove their only firm basis?" Now, you're about to get a news flash here. According to Thomas Jefferson, one of our least religious founding fathers, what's the only firm basis of national liberties? Here's what our least religious founding father said. He said, it is a conviction. Notice the word conviction. He said, it is a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they're not to be violated, but with his wrath. He said, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and his justice can't sleep forever. Jefferson says, guys, the only security you have for national liberties is to have a conviction that those liberties come from God, and if you start messing around with them, you're going to tick God off, and then we're all going to be in trouble if you get God ticked off. That's Jefferson telling the nation that? Yeah, it's engraved in stone in Washington, D.C. That's the only way to have government is to be convinced that our liberties come from God. So the secular mantra out there, that government's secular, that won't work. It will not make us unique. It will not keep us unique. This is the philosophy that produced American exceptionalism. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, back at the table we got all sorts of stuff, Founder's Bible and other things that will give you a lot of information on this. So what let's do, let's take about a 7-minute break and let's be back in. We'll hit the second session. Take about 7 minutes and we'll start promptly in about 7 minutes.